Allison gave me some practical advice about living with conditions. Whether those conditions are Parkinson's or climate change or the potential death of democracy, whatever your particular flavor of terror happens to be. The trick, as I understand it, is not to focus so much on the outcome, but instead concentrate on the process. The question to ask was not, where will this end, but what is the next right thing to do? What time tonight does Mature Latin Movers start? Can I go to taiko drumming on Monday?
If I pinned my hopes to a cure, I would just be waiting, and it wouldn't come, and I would get resentful and disappointed and depressed and be much more likely to fall off my perch quicker. So I pinned my hopes to living a life as well as I can, as good as I can, every day, from one day to the next. That's my hope.
Do the next right thing feels like the kind of slogan that would look good embroidered on a tea cozy or t-shirt, but I worried it didn't rise to the challenge of the actual world we seem to be living in, where every time you turn on the news, there are 10 different stories that make you feel mortally discouraged, like there really is nothing you can do. Allison, though, wouldn't accept this. Her bad future, she pointed out, had already arrived, but she still managed to move forward without letting the outcome of her disease define her everyday life. She wasn't saying it was going to be easy. She was just saying it was a viable strategy. Before I left Allison, I had her show me some of the things that she'd learned from her many classes. We started with her Japanese taiko drumming. Then she put her drumsticks away and brought out her saber, one of the weapons she uses in the Tai Chi classes she's been taking. I asked her to describe it.
It's about 3 foot long.
A 3 foot long saber?
It's just very beautiful. It's just very nicely balanced.
In the evenings, Allison picks up this enormous weapon and waves it through the air in a series of prescribed motions. She did them for me, her eyes shining and full of mischief, then lowered her weapon and pointed to the ceiling lamp hanging above us. It had an enormous gash in it.
It's a rip in the paper lampshade. That's where I got a bit carried away in my practicing with the saber.
Oddly enough, it was talking to Allison that gave me a new perspective on what happened with Joy and her husband Les. On the last day of the time that we spent together, Joy pulled her box of photos out of storage so she could show me a good picture of her husband.
Not that one. And it's not that one. It's this one.
It took a while, but she finally found one. Les was young and smiling a huge smile, with a white coat and thick eyebrows.
Very bushy eyebrows. Everybody commented on the caterpillars. The crowd loved playing with it. It was really funny.
Joy paused a moment, staring down at the image, and her face changed. You could see her eyes beginning to fill.
Why are you crying? Well, because it's just sad looking at the photographs. You know, looking at how happy we were. I still find that difficult. Going back.
It was
6 weeks before he died. Les became really animated about it. He was so pleased, and I got a glimpse again of that man who really cared, who really had purpose, and who could do something.
Joy says once word came back that she'd been right about the one supposed mistake she'd made during her smelling test, confirming that Joy really could predict the disease, Les had a eureka moment. Joy had smelled his Parkinson's more than a decade before diagnosis, so maybe he told Joy if they thought about it very carefully, they could pinpoint early symptoms that hadn't yet been identified by science.
We had to write down everything that happened so that medicine would understand what was happening to people with Parkinson's.
And so, for the last 6 weeks of his life, Joy and Les sat daily for writing sessions.
They would only last 35, 40 minutes at a time. And you'd maybe do 2 sessions in a day, but, the last 6 weeks were completely different. We spent some time every day discussing what happened to us over the last 20 odd years.
Through these discussions, Joy began to understand more about her husband's struggle.
I wasn't feeling his tiredness. I wasn't feeling how the tiredness made it different to work for him, or how it made it different for keeping our big house and garden.
Likewise, Les was able to see how his anger and impatience had hurt Joy.
He saw how erratic it had been sometimes for us. And that mattered. That really mattered to him.
Joy says Les had always shied away from talking about his Parkinson's. It just seemed like it was so existentially threatening to him, this terrible dread disease, that he just had to shove it away and couldn't acknowledge it. But once it became clear that Joy might hold in her nose the keys to moving research on Parkinson's forward, maybe one day even altering the way this condition evolved, Joy says he changed.
He became more affectionate, more personally affectionate for us. It was really quite nice, actually.
Your Les came back to you?
He did. He definitely did. Yes.
If you think about it, Joy and Les were actually doing a version of what Allison suggested we all do when faced with a difficult future. Their focus had shifted from what seemed like an inevitable outcome, struggle, pain, death, to what Les and Joy could do right now to live the best life they could. Talk, learn, contribute, love each other. And that shift apparently helped Les feel better. In fact, Joy says the work they were doing together in the last 6 weeks of his life was the last thing that she and Les ever talked about.
He made me promise that I would continue the research. He said, "You won't let this go. You will do it, won't you?" You promise. And a couple of hours later, he dropped dead. But I've done it. Yeah. I kept my promise. So it should make an awful lot of difference.
It might make a difference. It might not make a difference. The answer to that is in the future, and the future is impossible to know. But lately, whenever I felt overwhelmed, distressed that a terrible end is looming, I pull out my new little mantra and worry it like a rosary. Focus on the next right thing, I say to myself. Focus on the next right thing.
It's what
Focus
it
on the next
is.
right thing.
That's Elise Spiegel. And because we're living in this new reality right now, where it's pretty unclear what the future looks like, we at Invisibilia would love to hear from you, our listeners, about your next right thing. It could be tiny, it could be ambitious, it could be mundane, it could be very, very particular. We'll take any right things that you got. We truly could use the inspiration and advice. So, if you're game, please record a few sentences. Comes uniquely you. Interactive journal for kids.
It's packed with fun activities, tips for creating your own stories, and more. The Uniquely You Journal celebrates creativity and encourages kids to embrace what makes them unique. Find the Uniquely You Journal and Emmy and Friends graphic novels wherever books are sold.
When the city council candidate stood up and said he was black, some people in the room were like, yeah?
Guy said, I knew it. I knew it was a brother.
But other people suspected he was lying.
All the vinegar he was putting in the hair to make his hair stay curly and nappy.
So, did the man with the ginger brown afro and blue eyes lie about being black just to get the black vote?
No, he ain't black, he's white.
Or is there another way to think about what happened?
No. What do you mean by white?
Next week on NPR's Invisibilia, the story of a man whose blackness was fiercely contested and the havoc that wrought on his city.
Invisibilia is hosted by Hannah Rosen and Elise Spiegel. Our senior editors for this season are Deborah George and Anne Gudenkoff. This episode was produced by Elise Spiegel and Kia Miyaka Natis. Invisibilia is also produced by Yowei Shaw and Abby Wendell. Our manager is Liana Simstrom.
We had help on this episode from Alex Studson, David Goodhertz, and Pranav Bhaskar. Fact-checking by Joy Crane and Susie Cummings. Our technical director is Andy Huther, and our senior vice president of programming is Anya Grundman.
Special thanks to Mark Memmott, Micah Ratner, Emily Bogle, Jerry Holmes, Barbara Mario, Lawrence Carter-Long, Martha Nance, Karen Margolis, Elizabeth Ogren, and Deborah Fletcher.
To see an original illustration for this episode by Leonardo Santamaria, visit npr.org/invisibilia. Join us next week for more
Support for this podcast and the following message come from Choiceology, an original podcast from Charles Schwab. Hosted by decision scientist Katie Milkman, Choiceology is all about why we make irrational choices and how we can make better ones. Listen at schwab.com/podcast.
So, this might be the end of our season, but you can still stay connected with us all year round by following us on social media. Join a community of Invisibilians on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and keep up to date with all things Invisibilia, even in between seasons. Find us at NPR Invisibilia on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, which I hear all the young people are using.
The way we usually think about sound.
Is that it's not really a thing you can hold on to,
Like it's here and then it's gone.
but actually waves of sound are powerful, strong enough to pulse through air and water,
And solid objects. And when a sound reaches you,
like when you actually hear it,
it's because that sound is physically touching you
winding its way inside your ear
until it hits the drum in your head.
and plays it. This is NPR's Invisibilia. I'm Elise Spiegel.
And I'm Hannah Rosen. And today we're exploring the unique power of sound and how if we take the time to listen, what we hear helps us navigate what feels right and not so right about the world we're living in.
Producer Abby Wendell has a story for us today about a man who heard in sound a beautiful but also troubling reality.